Okay, for this brief presentation, I'm going to be looking at the situation after the First Crusade and towards the Second Crusade. So we're moving on in our story. Jerusalem falls in 1099 amid those scenes of bloodshed that I mentioned before. And crusading would never, of course, be the same again. Jerusalem was now in Christian hands. Immediately, the emphasis will start to shift, and defending Jerusalem will be critical. Almost straight away, they're forced to take action in this regard. They have to move down to the Egyptian coast to Ascalon, where they have to defeat the Fatimid relief force in 1099. So almost straight away, they have to turn onto the defensive. And this begins the period which is known as, or is collectively known as, the establishment of Outremer. Outremer meaning the land beyond the seas. The first major step towards this is in 1101, just 2 years after Jerusalem was taken. A further crusade is launched. Some historians even say that it was part of the First Crusade. It was so closely connected with it. There are a number of reasons why the 1101 crusade takes place. First of all, the First Crusade's successes inspire further crusaders. They want to follow suit. They want to have a piece of this glory. They want to go and see the Holy City, which is now, of course, in Christian hands. There's another factor as well. There's many of the crusaders who left at Antioch and turned for home. They now wanted to complete their oath. In some cases, such as Stephen of Blois, he had come back in such shame that his wife forced him to. So 1101 crusade is launched. Once again, we have huge numbers. Some historians think they almost had as many as the First Crusade itself. So it was a huge undertaking. It shows the popularity of crusading at this stage, in these early years of crusading. A further crusade is off the ground straight away. However, it fails, and this is significant. Its failure to really even reach the Holy Land, let alone provide any meaningful support for the newly born Crusader states, its failure meant something quite significant. First of all, crusading started to potentially lose its appeal. Crusading was no longer it questioned the idea that God would favour the Crusaders. So we've certainly got to change there. But secondly, we've also got the fact that the Crusader states, as they're forming, realised that maybe they're not going to be able to rely on the West and their fellows over in Western Europe to help them out. So the establishment of Outremer begins. And this is significant for our story in terms of why the nature and purpose of crusading changed, because from this point we are not just talking about crusaders coming out from the West with their ideas. We have this group of people in Outremer who are working with, at times, the Muslims. They're working in the politics of the region and so on. So what are some of the key areas of the establishment of Outremer? Well, I think the first thing to say, because it becomes so significant later on, is that their chief focus was to secure the coastline. They realised straight away that the coastline here, if we put in here, the coastline offers the best chance of economic viability. The land, the interior, was not particularly fertile. It was difficult to farm. Certainly Western farming methods weren't going to work in these circumstances. But the coastline offered the opportunity for trade. Where's my line gone? Oh, there it is. They offered the opportunity for trade. So places like Acre become a priority. Tyre is taken in 1122. Later, Ascalon, which they could have taken in 1099 but didn't because of disputes, they eventually take that in the 1050s. But the focus becomes the coastline. arguably before the Crusades themselves start to focus on it, the new settlers recognise the importance of the coastline. So that's important. They start building castles. They are in a minority. That's the first thing to say. I say the first thing to say, I've already said 3 or 4 things. That they're in a minority. The Christians are in a minority, and therefore they need to secure their gains. They do this through building castles. Many of the people like Fulcher of Chartres, who was somebody who came over to the Holy Land with the First Crusade and remained there, wrote with some amazement in the 1120s that they'd ever managed to survive. He said, it still seems hard to believe that they ever managed to survive. One of the reasons for their survival, and again this is important, is one of the reasons for the success of the First Crusade. The fact is that Muslim divisions were still very, very apparent. And you have different groups fighting against one another, which allows Baldwin the First and Baldwin the Second, these two very able kings of Jerusalem, to build up their holdings on the coast. They are supported by support from the West. Small groups of crusaders arrive in the Holy Land, not the large-scale success, the crusade that we saw in the First Crusade, but smaller groups, a particular noble, a particular lord, the Counts of Flanders, the King of Norway, King Sigurd of Norway in 1108. They arrive and they bring troops and they help to sustain these new Crusader states as they develop along the Levantine coast. Also, of course, I don't know why the M's been scrubbed out, let's finish that off, there we are. The military orders become important. The military orders start to develop in around the 1120s, really. They start to become apparent. And this helps to solve the major issue facing Outremer, which is manpower. As we said, they're in a minority and they lack manpower. The advantage of the military orders is they are utterly committed to the survival of the Crusader states, and they are incredibly well-trained troops, and they help to sustain the Christian presence in the Holy Land. I think I've put castles again there, which we've said before already. So, Outremer is established. There's one other thing that I think is worth mentioning, though, is the fact that the settlers, the nobility in the Holy Land, they start to recognise they can't live. They can't continue to attack the Muslims as they had done on the First Crusade, and they start to recognise the need for diplomacy. So we start to see some diplomatic manoeuvres and truces being formed with Muslim powers as they seek to survive in the Holy Land. So things that become a feature of later crusades: diplomacy, as was in the Third Crusade, focus on the coastline, again in the Third Crusade. You can see elements of that already as early as the early 12th century.